hppodcraft.com.
I think Lovecraft, as he went on, realized that this is something he could build on. That adding to this myth cycle that he had created resulted in stories that became more than just stories. They became an entire universe.
All right, we're back at the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast
at hppodcraft.com.
And that opening excerpt that we just heard was from an interview we did with a certain scholar.
A scholar by the name of S.T. Joshi, who is the Lovecraftian scholar, the living Lovecraftian scholar, and maybe of all time Lovecraftian scholar, having written over 20 different books or publications involving the work of H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, and we actually originally did an interview with ST because we wanted to cut it into our Call of Cthulhu episodes, but we just had so much goodness to talk about in those 3 episodes that we didn't really have room for it. And so we wanted to play the whole thing here. Also, we sort of meandered in onto some other topics about Lovecraft's life and even about his sartorial habits, his suit buying phase.
Yeah.
So we're just going to play that for you here now. It's a phone interview that Chris and I did with ST.
Yes, right.
Anything you wanted to add to that before we roll it?
It's sweet.
Anything else you want to add to that?
No, S.T. Joshi was really great and a good guy to talk to, and hopefully we'll have him back on the show again.
Yeah, I hope so. All right, and here is the interview. This is Chad Pfeiffer, joined, of course, by Chris Lackey, and we are here on the phone with preeminent Lovecraft scholar S.T. Joshi. S.T., welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And thanks so much for coming on the show. We've just been covering the Call of Cthulhu in our last few episodes, and we've had a few thoughts on the transition in Lovecraft's writing upon returning to Providence from his short stint in New York. We noticed that his writing after his move seemed a lot more sophisticated, a lot more rich. Do you have any thoughts about what might have been going on with him, why he seemed to improve so much?
You know, it's kind of hard to say because the transition really was astoundingly fast. I mean, if you look at how much he wrote in a very short period of time after coming back from that horrible period in New York, he never had any that kind of outburst of fiction before or since. I mean, Call of Cthulhu, Color Out of Space, Charles Dexter Ward, Dreamcast of Unknown Kadath, Silver Key, Pickman's Model, I mean, and even a couple other things. It's unbelievable. It's as if that return from New York just opened some sort of floodgate, not only in terms of quantity, but, as you suggest, also in terms of this incredible, quality and sophistication that we really hadn't seen before. I think what was happening is that he really felt bottled up creatively in New York. He just couldn't write in that environment. I mean, I think he came to realize how much his hometown of Providence meant to him, how much that whole New England milieu meant to him, that he simply was himself an outsider. In fact, he calls himself an alien in New York City, which is interesting because, of course, he had a certain contempt for other aliens in racially speaking. So it's interesting that he acknowledged that he was himself an alien in the environment of New York. I mean, the stuff he wrote in New York was really quite poor. Only three fairly insignificant works of fiction, one of which, The Horrid Red Hook, I think is one of his worst pieces of work, and I think he acknowledged that too. So I think that, W. Paul Cook made an interesting remark. He felt that Lovecraft had to go through that New York phase to understand what kind of a man and what kind of a writer he was. Cook said he came back pure gold. It's as if Lovecraft needed to get away from New England to realize how much New England meant to him. And so when he came back, all this stuff just came out.
Yeah, it's sort of like how Hemingway said he had to move to Paris to write about Michigan.
That's right.
Well, I was just curious, I mean, how much do you think at all, how much of his marriage ending, if there was something, because he doesn't write too much about his relationship. Like in his letters, we don't have too much insight really about what went on in there, do we?
Yeah, no, we don't. what we would love to have, of course, are his letters to his own wife, to Sonia. Well, especially before they married him. She said that he would write 30, 40-page letters to her, and once a week or something like that. But then, of course, she says that, after the divorce and in the 1930s, she went out into a field and burned all his
them.
letters. Oh my God!
Yes.
That's so painful to think about. But hey, that's her choice,
Yeah.
So and he doesn't really let his hair down about what was going on. To his aunts, he kind of does. You read those letters to his aunts during that New York period, you get a pretty good idea of what was happening. Of course, she wasn't even there for much of that period, especially
Right.
not 1925. She had
Right.
to go to work in the Midwest and only came back a couple of weeks at a time. I think Lovecraft also realized that the marriage was a mistake, and he wrote about it very indirectly, and maybe not so indirectly, in that later story, The Thing on the Doorstep, which I think is a clear reflection of his own marriage to an older woman who was perhaps a little domineering. In fact, Frank Belknap long told me that he used that exact word to me when he described Sonia, that she was somewhat of a domineering person.
Wow.
Sort of like Asenath Waite, who knows, a little bit like that. So that comes through. Although Lovecraft said later on, I can't detect any difference in my writing before I married and after I married. Well, I don't know if that's entirely true. I mean, he never talks about sex or anything like that anyway in his fiction, except very covertly. I mean, clearly there was some sort of shenanigans going on in the Dunwich Horror with Lavinia Waitley and in Thing on the Doorstep. But aside from that, you don't get too much there. But
yeah, we always laugh about Thing on the Doorstep because the female character turns out to actually be a man. Anyway,
I know that's kind of weird. Basically, this fellow has married his his father-in-law or something. It's like pretty weird. But Lovecraft doesn't even suggest anything like that.
No.
I think it's more. I don't see a lot of the. I think he was just. I mean, let's be honest. I think he was glad to be rid of Sonia. I mean, he realized that was kind of a mistake also. And he was just not the marrying kind. He liked. It's not true that he was a misogynist or anything like that. That's just a falsehood. He liked women, friends, but he wanted them to be just friends, correspondents. He had a number of good women correspondents, but that's kind of what he wanted. And he liked to have, the protection of his aunts, one aunt or the other, sort of looking after him while he did his thing. And that's what he got when he came back to Providence.
I was wondering, specifically, Call of Cthulhu is one of Lovecraft's most, popular stories. And, a lot of people have know it and know what it's about. And Cthulhu, of course, has just permeated our culture, in a subculture, of course. But what do you think about the Call of Cthulhu? Why it's so popular, has resonated with so many people, and it's kind of really spawned all of these imitators and people that want to keep writing in the setting?
Well, it's a great story. It is a brilliantly constructed story, I think. I love that sense, the sort of the narrative fragmentation that goes on, which reflects that opening line of the story, the correlating of the contents. Only at the end do we realize how all these disparate pieces of information finally hang together. But you have to realize, of course, if Lovecraft had written just the Call of Cthulhu and none of the other later stories, maybe the mythos would have happened, maybe not. But I think Lovecraft, as he went on, realized that this is something he could build on. That adding to this myth cycle that he had created resulted in stories that became more than just stories. They became an entire universe of fictive imagination.
Yeah.
Therefore, they became greater than the sum of their parts, and that, I think, is what really captured people's imaginations.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, most people that we speak with about Lovecraft, they had a moment maybe in the early teens or mid-teens where they got their hands on that first paperback copy of Lovecraft stories, and it sort of set their imagination on fire and brought them to this lifelong preoccupation with unknowable, unnameable things out there gibbering in the dark. Did you have a moment like that?
Well, here's the funny thing. I discovered Lovecraft, of course, in my early teens, as almost everyone else does. Maybe 12, 13, 14, something like that. I can't remember exactly. But the funny thing is, I made the mistake, in fact, of starting by trying to read At the Mountains of Madness, which is a very dense piece of work, and when I was, at that time I didn't have much training in science. My high school or junior high school was terrible in science, so didn't know much about it. So I said, about halfway through, I said, "Oh my God, this is like way beyond me. It's like you need a PhD to understand this book." So I put it away. I hadn't heard of Lovecraft. I just saw his books in my public library, and it sounded kind of interesting. Just the titles. So I picked up At the Mountains of Madness, and I just said, I can't get through this. This is just too dense for me. So then I put that back. A couple months later, I started the Dunwich Horror and others, and that got me. Not the first two stories. In fact, I thought In the Vault. To this day, I think In the Vault is a pretty bad story.
I agree.
I don't know what possessed August Derleth to put that as the lead story of that book. That was a huge mistake. And even the next story, Pickman's Model, doesn't really. I really don't run a temperature over Pickman's Model, frankly. Although I love that Boston background, and I've actually been to Copp's Hill Burying Ground and North End, of course, which is all different now. But nevertheless, I have trod on Pickman's footsteps in that sense. But, even that, I don't think is such a great story. But then the Rats in the Walls, I think that actually is what got to me. And then that sucked me in, and then I just consumed the rest of the volume, and every one of the other stories is fabulous in that book. And so that's what really got to me.
Yeah, we had some disagreement over In the Vault. Chris didn't like it. I liked it for its Tales from the Crypt style kind of goofiness, but we were in agreement about Rats in the Walls, and a lot of people have told us that it was the first Lovecraft story that really got to them.
Yeah, it's another flawless short story. I mean, really, one of the most tightly constructed short stories that I've ever read.
Yeah. Love it. We use your books as a lot of reference for our show, so I was wondering if there's any particularly interesting nuggets about the Call of Cthulhu that you may, have, filed away somewhere, or some ideas that you may, some thoughts that you've had on that, something you might not have necessarily wanted to publish, but maybe, an interesting idea or some bits of information or suspicions that you might have about something in the story. Does that make any sense?
Well, yeah, it kind of does. Well, I'll tell you, there was one piece of frustrating situation, because in the selected letters, as Lovecraft has finished the story in like summer or fall of 1926, he writes to Clark Ashton Smith saying, "Oh yeah, here's this story, this sunken land story that I talked about a year ago," and so here it is. So I said, "Oh wow, what would he have said to Smith a year before?" Because he had outlined the story in August of 1925 when he was still in New York, and that's the incredible thing. In fact, that early first 2 weeks of August of 25 were incredible. In August 1st and 2nd, he wrote The Horror at Red Hook. Then about 9 days later, he went on this long sort of antiquarian tour of like Elizabethtown, New Jersey, and places like that, and he wrote the story He.
Yeah.
And the very next day, we have his little diary of 1925, only a couple lines per day. But he says, then the very next day, he says, "Write out story plot, The Call of Cthulhu." I mean, he has actually already come up with the title then, with the name Cthulhu at that time.
Uh-huh.
So I said, "Wow, what could this be?" So after many years, we finally got Lovecraft's letters to Clark Ashton Smith, and they'll be published, I hope, next year in an annotated edition.
Oh, nice.
But he doesn't say anything. He's like, I have this idea. Oh, it's so frustrating. I would love to know what was his idea. Did he actually work out the whole story plot? He must have, I suppose. Because he doesn't say, "Oh, well, it's totally different from what I said before," or whatever. But it's incredible to think that he had actually worked out the entire plot a full year before he wrote the story. But he couldn't write it in New York. The atmosphere was all wrong, so he had to come back to Providence to write it.
Now, I believe I heard a story that Lovecraft was burglarized when he was living in New York.
Yeah, that was kind of a sad situation. I mean, it's so typical that robbers rob the poor instead of the rich, so often, because the poor can't afford any protection. Yeah, he was living in this real dump in Brooklyn Heights. I say dump because now Brooklyn Heights is a very expensive part of Brooklyn now. It's really
It's
gotten
been
renovated.
gentrified,
and,
yeah.
Oh, totally gentrified now. I mean, his apartment, if you're still a private residence, it must be. I mean, I don't even know what it costs now to live there. But in his day, it was exactly $10 a week. You know, it was dirt cheap. You know, it was the cheapest thing he could afford, and it happened to be near some of his other friends like Samuel Loveman and Hart Crane. But and he thought it would be an okay place to be, but it was just a rat trap. I mean, he had mice, and it was awful. But he was living in basically one-room apartment with what he called a little dressing alcove. Now, and that alcove actually had a door leading out to the hallway, I guess, of the building. And that door was not well latched. I think the latch or lock was broken or something, and he never bothered to get it fixed. The landlord never fixed it. So one day he was sleeping in the main room, which is where I guess they had some sort of bed or sofa bed or something. He was sleeping, and his schedule was all weird. You know, he slept during the day a lot of times, and so he was sleeping there, and these people, whoever they were, robbers, broke into this dressing alcove, took all his clothing. I mean, took 3 of his 4 suits. The only suit that he didn't lose was the one that was hanging on the chair in the main room. You know, they didn't go into the main room. So they took 3 of his suits and these winter coats and even a radio set that Loveman was storing there and a bunch of other stuff. And he was crestfallen. I mean, this is like the complete symbol of why Lovecraft shouldn't be in New York City. It's like, my God. And so it's funny. He spent the next several months becoming a very shrewd bargain hunter for suits, because Lovecraft did not feel comfortable without 4 suits, 2 light suits for summer and 2 heavier suits for winter. And right now he only had the one, I think a one summer suit. So he literally, he goes on and on. I mean, he charts this adventure of finding cheap suits in multiple letters to his aunts, going on and on and on and on about where to go to get cheap suits, and how he bargains people down. I mean,
man, I would love to read that.
It becomes kind of disturbing. He's clearly kind of what is the term? A little obsessive compulsive about this whole situation.
Right.
But being properly dressed was very important to Lovecraft. He didn't want to look like a bum.
He didn't tell. I heard, maybe this is not true, but I heard he didn't tell his friends about this. That he kept it secret that he was robbed. Is that true or no?
I don't know. No, I think he must have told at least some close friends like Frank Long, because he also solicited their advice as to where he could get cheap suits. So I think and they knew it's hard to conceal something like that. So I think they must have known. But it was very mortifying to Lovecraft.
So so that's maybe one of those great pieces of Lovecraft's fiction that is still yet to be canonized. The suit in the window, or something like that. With that last italicized sentence, I didn't like the way I looked.
Yeah, I mean, he literally draws a picture of the suit that he really likes. I mean, it's incredible. He just goes on and on and on. So. Kind of sad too.
There are some fragments of Lovecraft stories out there that we've covered on the show, like The Descendant, and we've always felt maybe unsure if we should be talking about them because they weren't meant for publication. How do you feel about that?
Anything by Lovecraft is worth reading and worth discussing. I mean, that's just a tribute to his stature as a writer. I mean, obviously, we don't want to put a great deal of weight in these fragments, but they're very interesting to suggest where his imagination was going. That story, The Descendant, I think was he wanted to set a story in London because he in the spring of 1927, again toward the end of this great burst of fiction writing when he just finished Case of Charles Lester Ward, he said he was doing a lot of studying of London, topography and things like that, because he wanted to set a story there, and I think that's where The Descendant came from, and he started writing this thing. But it's clear he didn't really have a plot. He didn't know where to go with this story. I mean, he talks about the Necronomicon, but he got hung up. I mean, he didn't really have a plot worked out clearly. So it's just a false thread there. It wasn't going anywhere. My theory about the fragment called The Book which was written later, in the 30s, is that that's an attempt to write out the fungi from Yuggoth sonnet sequence. Because it's clear that fragment, again, it's a guy going into a bookstore and finding some weird book. I don't know if he actually calls it the Necronomicon. I can't remember. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But coming back and again, strange things sort of happening. But then it just sort of peters out after that. But that fragment clearly is a kind of attempt to rewrite in prose at least the first 3 sonnets of the fungi from Yuggoth. But again, Lovecraft got stalled. I think he said, "Oh, well, where do I go from here now? I mean, what do I do with this thing?" That fragment was written, I think, at a time when his career was a little. I mean, he was having trouble. He had gotten some rejections. At the Mountains of Madness had gotten rejected by Weird Tales. A collection of his stories had gotten rejected by Putnam's, and then Knopf in 1933. He initially solicited him for a story, but then a story collection, and then rejected him. He was really kind of down in the dumps. These rejections really affected him painfully, and so I think he didn't know where to go with his writing. So he was doing some experimentation to see if he could, revive himself.
We have a lot of laughs on the show, sometimes at the expense of the writing, but also Chris and I have read plenty of Lovecraft. But as we've gone back through the stories, I found that Lovecraft actually had a pretty great sense of humor. Maybe that wasn't clear to me before.
That's right. It takes a while to pick up on that because Lovecraft's very keen on creating a sort of very intense atmosphere of horror, and in his letters he says, "Oh, I don't think humor and horror mix very well," but I think he was referring to things that sort of make fun of horror, like Oscar Wilde's The Canterville Ghost or H.G. Wells' The Inexperienced Ghost, which almost sort of make fun of horror as a genre, and Lovecraft probably took offense at that. His humor though is subtle but and concealed and sort of under the surface, but it's there. It really comes out at curious moments. I'm just preparing an annotated edition of The Case of Charles Victor Ward, which should come out later from University of Tampa Press this year. And there's some really funny things in there if you read it carefully. For example, all right, so here's Dr. Willett, who's gone through that underground area pit in Joseph Kerwin kept his these horrible creatures that he fashioned from imperfect salts, and he actually taken the lid off of one of them, and there's this horrible half finished entity down there that actually apparently crunches his flashlight and stuff like that. So and he comes out of it and says, "Oh God, that was awful." But he says he vowed to leave no stone unturned to get to the bottom. Of course, that's referring to that that pit that he uncovered as well. So
right. Yes.
A very, very funny little pun that he throws in there at what you think is a climactic moment in the story. And maybe the first 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times you read it, you don't get it, but then you said, "Oh my God, that's really pretty funny."
Well, I mean, even in Reanimator, kind of that there's a sort of, Herbert West keeps saying, he goes, "Well, the body just wasn't fresh enough." Like every time, at the end of every part of that so it was almost like, it was almost funny.
Oh, my contention, and I know there's no way to prove this, is that Lovecraft started writing Herbert West with a straight face, but as he went along, he says, "This story's preposterous," and it became a parody later on because the way that Herbert West tries to reanimate the dead becomes more and more outlandish.
Yeah,
toward the end, he's only reanimating parts of the dead. Like he has this head, in a vat of whatever formaldehyde or something, in the back of the room.
Yes, yeah.
It just becomes just totally absurd at the end. And I think the Hound is hilariously funny.
Yes.
And yet horrifying also. But there's some really funny stuff in the Hound as well.
Well, there's that kind of. It's a piece that Lovecraft in the early days. Was it Sweet Ermengarde? Is that the name?
Yes.
Sweet Ermengarde. Oh yeah, I tell you, I at the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival in Portland, Oregon one year, maybe 2 years ago, I brought that story to read to the audience. And if I may say so, I floored them. I just broke them up. It is a hilarious story. I mean, Lovecraft really could have been a good comic writer if he wanted to be. And he wrote that one. He wrote a reminiscence of Samuel Johnson, which is just sort of funny. Ibid, that little thing about Ibid is pretty funny. But Sweet Arm to God really is the crown jewel of Lovecraft's comic stories. Yeah, so I just got copies of my new anthology, Black Wings, Tales of Lovecraftian Horror, all original stories, some really sensational pieces. I mean, they're all good, but I particularly like the ones by like Caitlin Kiernan and Michael Shea and Laird Barron, and we have a good cast list here. And in fact, the publisher, Pete Crowther of PS Publishing in England, already wants a second volume, and I've already set up a list of contributors for a second volume, maybe 2 years down the road.
When is that going to be available for us to buy?
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, right now the book is published only in the UK. Although I think you can order copies from the UK, and maybe there's some book dealers in the US that have some. I have an agent working on getting a US publisher for this book, and hopefully the next one too. So I hope this will be available here more widely.
Well, I'll be picking it up here in the UK.
Good. One more plug, maybe you know about this. My unabridged Lovecraft biography is coming out in 2 volumes later this summer from Hippocampus. The version published by Necronomicon Press in 1996 was a mere 350,000 words, like 500 and some thousand words. So you'll get even more of my maunderings about Lovecraft, lots more detail about a lot of things. So if you want to read even more day-by-day accounts of what Lovecraft was doing, you can pick that up.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Joshi,
Yes.
we want to thank you very much.
Thank you for all of your work. It's been really important to the show, and I hope we can have you on again.
Hey, it was great talking to you.
So there it is. There it was.
Yeah, wow. Man, that was great stuff.
It was. I don't know. ST was okay, but those interviewers were incredible.
Those guys were awesome. They were on fire. So many good questions. They're the ones that had to work. He already knew all that stuff.
That's right. They had all the hard stuff to do.
Yeah. They did the heavy lifting.
So the plugs for the ST's books, we'll put some links up on the show notes so you can check those out. Hopefully in future episodes we'll have him back on to discuss a little further. Absolutely, and I'm definitely going to be adding those to my collection. That's right. Now speaking of collections, two black bottles. Next week, however, we're going to be taking some time off, maybe 1 or 2 weeks, depending on our schedule, because Chad and I have 2 conflicting things going. Chad's going to be out of town one time, and then I'm going to be out of town. So It might be 2 weeks, but we might be able to work it in at some point, maybe just 1. No promises. We do want to talk about the story Two Black Bottles, which is a collaboration that Lovecraft did with Wilfred. I shouldn't say Wilfred. Wilfred? Yeah, Wilfred Branch Tallman. I'm excited to cover that one. I'm looking forward to talking about it. Okay. Well, with that, I'm Chad Pfeiffer. And I'm Chris Lackey. And this has been the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast. At hppodcraft.com. HPPodcraft.com.